we will first start by acknowledging that our work with ONlit does take place on the traditional Indigenous territories, and we acknowledge that there are 46 treaties and other agreements that cover the territory now called Ontario. We are thankful to be able to work on this land, and we are thankful to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people for their care for and teachings about the earth. This acknowledgement reminds us of our responsibilities to our relationships and to the ancestral lands on which we learn, work, and live. So if you're new to ONlit, welcome. We're so glad you're here. A little bit about us before we dive into our agenda for this evening. We are a collaborative project between Dyslexia Canada and the International Dyslexia Association Ontario, IDA Ontario. We really prioritize research-driven practices in Ontario schools with the goal of bridging that research to practice gap to support stronger student outcomes. And our role specifically is to support the rollout of the revised language curriculum and also the new early reading screening. And to do that, we gratefully acknowledge that funding for ONlit has been provided by the Ontario Ministry of Education, but we do note that the views expressed are the views of ONlit and don't necessarily reflect those of the Ministry of Education. So tonight you'll hear from me. My name's Una Malcolm. I'm with Dyslexia Canada and ONlit and IDA Ontario. And we also have two wonderful educators joining us today who you'll hear a lot from. Marlene Perry, who is a K-12 literacy consultant in the York Catholic District School Board, and Robin Carnahan, who is a principal in the Avon-Maitland District School Board. So we're so thankful you're here, and we're looking forward to getting started. And with that, Marlene, I will pass that over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Malcolm. So welcome, everybody. Tonight's agenda, we're going to run through this list of topics. So why are we screening? What is a reading screener? How is this different than past practice? Where does screening fit in? And what are the measures that we're doing when we are administering a screener? And how do we use the data? Who is getting screened and when are we responsible for administering the screeners? And just to let you know, if you haven't seen it yet, that we do have a document that's in the ONlit resource library titled Screening, What Principals Need to Know. And this should serve you well as a roadmap for your responsibility as administrators within an Ontario school. It's essentially a summary from all the key points from PPM 168. So you can find that again. I believe Alicia's going to put that in the link. And we also have it en français. So why early reading screening? So the ministry has mandated reading screening in response to the Ontario Human Rights Commission report. The Right to Read report was released February 28th, 2022. In this report, there was 157 recommendations made to the province of Ontario in regards to literacy instruction practices that we need to decommission and recommendations of things that need to be implemented to ensure that all students have the chance to read within our education system successfully. And some quotes right from the Right to Read report that we wanted to share. Universal early screening is not only effective, but also necessary to protect the rights of all students, particularly students from many code-protected groups. It facilitates early interventions, reduces the potential for bias, and creates better decision-making around student outcomes. And it's our hope that tonight, when you leave this meet, that you will have a far better understanding as to how it addresses all the comments that we just read. So first, we'll start off with some understanding of the Matthew effect. And the Matthew effect is talking about, it can be used in regards to any accumulated advantage. This group might like to know that some people refer to it as the Matthew effect principle. And that's a fun fact. But essentially what it's showing is that when there's an advantage, it will widen over a period of time. And in this regard, we're talking about the ability to read and reading skills. And what it's stating is that students that at an earlier time start off as weak readers eventually will continue along that trajectory, and strong readers will continue to move upwards. And the gap is widening because those that are stronger readers will want to dive into reading more, practice more, be exposed to it more, and keep continually progressing while leaving that gap widening between the discrepancy of students. And so the key thing to understand here is that if you intervene early and you can instruct towards strengthening a child's reading skills, that there won't be such a large gap. And that's one of the key reasons why the implementation of reading screening is going to be such a success. I promise. There's a quote for us: reading difficulties that begin early in life are devastatingly stable across a child's school career. So what is a reading screener? So the purpose: screening identifies which students and which systems are at risk. I think there is not clear understanding in that regard, that many people probably recognize that the intention is to identify which students are at risk, but we're going to demonstrate tonight how it really can inform a system's strength of instruction or their tools that they're using. And we're going to guide you along a path of understanding. The goals of screening is to improve student outcomes, and then again, also to inform school and system level practices, programs, and interventions. So if you're aware, the ministry not only mandated the implementation of screening, but they've also asked that the data be stored, collected, so that it can serve or speak towards the second purpose, so that schools and system leaders can look at the data and make informed decisions. So how is this different than past practices, Doctor?
I will jump back in. Thanks, Marlene. And we'll just walk through, certainly recognizing this is a time of great change, recognizing this is a new policy, things are shifting quite quickly. And it is, we think we wanted to just take a little bit of time in recognizing what are some of these key shifts. How does this screening that we'll be undertaking this fall, how is this different from what might have happened in the past? There we go. So to think about those purposes, Marlene highlighted really that the goal of screening is to understand risk, to understand which students are at risk and which systems are at risk. And in order to accomplish this goal and to meet this purpose, there are specific criteria that we know a screener needs to meet in order to be able to actually achieve this goal. So to do this, we know that a screener has to be fast. We know it has to be reliable and valid, and we'll unpack what each of these pieces are in a few moments. We know it needs to serve as an indicator of early reading skills, and we know it needs to be predictive. So we can think about these sort of four main criteria for what we need in order to meet that goal of identifying risk early, so that way we have the time and the availability to reduce that risk with good, strong instruction. So we'll unpack each of these and highlight a little bit about how this might be a bit of a shift. So firstly, early reading screening, universal screening is designed to be fast. And we can think of that name universal screening as a hint to why it needs to be fast. This is something that we're doing with everybody. And if we're going to be doing this with everybody, we can't afford to be burning or using so much instructional time to go through really lengthy individual reading assessments with students. We know that the purpose of assessment is to drive stronger student outcomes and to inform instruction. So in order to do that, we actually need to make sure that we're maximizing the academic learning time and the opportunity for explicit instruction to build these early literacy skills. So we know it needs to be fast. Here you can see on the slide, this is just a sample from Ames Web Plus. This is one of the Ontario approved screening tools, highlighting that many of these individual measures just take a moment or two per student. It's just a few minutes. This might be in contrast to past practices with a running record-based assessment, where students would have to do multiple levels, either testing up or testing down, to find their independent or instructional reading level. So we know we need to optimize the amount of time and really focus on having brief measures so we can free up the opportunity for the most important piece, the instruction. We also know that to be effective screeners, a tool needs to be reliable and it needs to be valid. And these are terms that, you might hear a lot, but they have really specific meanings when it comes to research and specifically how, assessments and psychometrics, how this is all built out and researched. So when we think about reliability, what that actually means is whether a test is consistent and accurate. So can it produce data that, for example, if multiple educators were using the same tool, are their scores quite similar, or do we see huge variations in between individual users? How consistent are these data when they're being used and implemented? And when we think about validity, we think about, is this actually measuring what it is that we want to measure? How does this map on to these skills that we know we need to measure and to screen for students to have that opportunity for high quality instruction? It's important to note that these aren't just qualitative words that we use of saying, yes, this is a reliable and valid tool. These are things that researchers actually calculate, and this comes from specific research evaluating the psychometric adequacy, or how reliable, how valid these assessment tools are. So you can see there's a screenshot there. That's from the Technical Manual of Acadiance Reading, another ministry-approved screener. And you can see just a snapshot of the data of exactly how the data are researched and then transparently shared. So that way people can be critical consumers in terms of how trustable the data are. This is quite different than past practices. Many of the running record-based assessments, DRA, the benchmark assessment system, either has not been researched at all like this, so you actually can't access this type of data because it hasn't been researched like that, or it has been and has been proven to be, unreliable and not valid. So we know that if we are to trust the data that comes out of an assessment tool, we know it needs to be researched like this. Another key piece we know we need to be mindful of is that screening needs to be able to give indicators of early reading skills. And we've given a photo of a child with a thermometer and with a temperature there, just recognizing that, again, that role of the screener is to assess risk. We don't know everything we need to know when we take a child's temperature, but it gives us a pretty quick and easy way of knowing, is there something at play here? Is there risk? Is there a problem? Now, to do this, this is not necessarily something where we need to tap every single literacy skill that there is. There are many, many, many skills that contribute to a reader being a skilled and proficient reader. But we know there are really specific checkpoints that we want to look at along that reading journey, along that road to proficient reading, that tell us if a child is on track. And we know that screening needs to give a quick indicator of that. It doesn't need to assess every reading skill there is, but we need to capture quick little samples of those skills that we know from research are the most critical ones. And then we also, for screening to really allow us to drive stronger student outcomes, we know that ideally we would like it to be predictive. It is something where reading difficulties, I think we can all think about students who we've had where they've had really a very difficult time learning to read. And that's something where, I wouldn't wish that for any child. If we have the opportunity to prevent reading difficulties and to prevent some of the difficulties that come with reading being a challenge, that's something we absolutely should be able to do. So part of the back end of the research behind these screeners that we're going to be moving towards in Ontario is that researchers were able to conduct research that tells us that follows many students over time and can tell us, how does a child need to be doing in kindergarten to be on track down the road? How does a child need to be doing in grade 1 to be on track down the road? It allows us to know really early on whether a child is on track or whether we need to think about offering them additional supports. Just to that Matthew effect graph Marlene showed, that screener, this predictive piece, really allows us to catch that gap when it's quite small. And this is something that our past practices didn't quite allow. So just to highlight that this is, again, a shift of moving away from different assessments that we may have in our systems previously. We can, in speaking about some of these reading level-based assessments, researchers highlighted they are not standardized and publishers do not always evaluate and report their validity and reliability. And those that do often have significant caveats. We know that the assessments that we may have used in the past just don't have that same research support that we know that we need for them to be trustable sources of data. Now, recognizing that this is a big shift, I think we wanted to make sure we framed out, where does this screening fit? Again, recognizing there's a lot going on in terms of assessment, evaluation, reporting, and certainly instruction. So where does screening fit into this complex ecosystem? And I did just want to frame out that, my assessment training really highlights assessments as ways to answer questions. It allows us to answer questions about individual students, and it allows us to answer questions about systems as well. So there are many questions we can ask about students, but if we boil them down, there are 3 key ones that we can think of. And the first one is, who needs help, right? Who needs additional support? Who is in need of additional help to support those strong outcomes that we want for them? We can also think about, what should that support be, right? We know there are students who need support. What specific elements of that support should we think about firming up for that child? What do they need help with? And then when that support is being provided, is it working? Is it helping? How is this child doing? Is the gap being closed? So we can think about those as sort of three different questions, and we can think about responding to those or answering those with different types of assessments. And our focus tonight really is screening. Who needs help? That's our way of identifying which students are in need of support. It doesn't necessarily answer what exactly should that support be, and then which we would answer with diagnostic assessment, and then is that help working, which we would answer with progress monitoring. So while our focus tonight is certainly screening, ONlit has many other resources where we focused on sort of how these different purposes for assessment work in cohort with each other, and what that looks like in terms of interpreting data across multiple different systems. So certainly the first piece, but we did just want to frame out that this is one bigger piece of a much bigger, much more complex system. And with that, Marlene, I will pass it back over to you.
So it's important to recognize how Dr. Malcolm just described the place that screening fits within our assessment practices. And right from the PPM, we need to recognize that screening does not replace classroom-based assessment for learning, assessment as learning, or assessment of learning. The screening is doing exactly what our doctor described, which is it's serving as a predictor for future success and helping us determine which students need support in the moment. So from PPM 168, screeners should not be used solely to determine special programming. So I've heard this said amazingly from a colleague from another board actually that said they're screeners, not streamers. And that is a misunderstanding that's out there that we need to clear up, that people, I think when they first were hearing the term screening, they were thinking they could use it to identify students for spec ed services or to maybe take them out or put them in special programming, such as something like French immersion. That is not what these are meant to be used for, and that's clearly stated in the PPM. So what the idea is, again, the temperature check and the whole, we'll talk more about this in a few minutes, but essentially with the screener, you're identifying a child that may need a boost of instruction or some sort of medicine to help bring them up to benchmark. And we'll talk about that as we move along. It's not for initially like right away flagging somebody for special services or demission from something else. And also really important to understand, they should never be used for evaluation or report card marks. So what a child achieves in regards to their screener is not going to be translated into that language mark on their report card or their communication of learning. And again, it's all in the developing and understanding what a screener is, where this will become clear, but that is, as instructional leaders of your school, that is a message that needs to be communicated clearly. So what are the measures? What exactly is a screener? So a universal reading screener involves administering a series of measures to identify students who may be at risk for future reading difficulties, as we mentioned. I've been doing a lot of in-servicing with teachers in my school board, and I keep saying, even though I'm guilty of it too, I want us to try and move to a practice of not calling it an assessment. If we can, try to just keep sticking to the word screener, and then we won't get confused about, putting that mark on the report card. So if we keep using the term screener, it will become clear what it's used for. But also, some people refer to the little parts of a screener as the subtests or the tests. And you will find in some of these products, they actually refer to them as measures. So that's another new word we can add to our vocabulary as teachers, that we're administering a screener that has several measures to it. So what are those measures? Well, the measures are different depending on which screener your board has chosen to go with, and we'll introduce you to those in a moment. But what they all have in common, regardless of which one you went with, they all have measures that speak to these essential early literacy skills. And so I know Dr. Malcolm talked about how there are key skills that have been chosen to be measured. And there are more skills that go into, fluent and reading comprehension. But the key ones that is undisputable from research and science and that are largely agreed upon is these 5 here. So phonemic awareness, phonics, basic decoding, advanced decoding, word recognition, and comprehension. And so what you see on the right there is what some of those measures might be called in those screening products that are being used to address the specific early literacy skill. And just a really quick intro to what they are. So phonemic awareness is, can a child identify the smallest units of sound within a word? And there's different measures to look for that. Phonics is where we get into that continuum of code, they call it. So our English or French orthography has these patterns of code in them where you have the grapheme, the letters match into a phoneme, a sound. And are the children learning the patterns of that orthography? And then that would be in basic decoding, and it would be sort of the first lessons. And then advanced coding is where you're getting into more complex code. So looking at vowel teams, our control vowels, things like that. And then word recognition, other strategies, teaching to morphology. The last one, comprehension, is the essential goal of reading instruction. Can a child read and understand and gain meaning from what they're reading in front of them? So again, these are the names of the measures in one of the screeners, and they may vary in the other products, but they all are testing the same 5 essential skills. So when we look at the early literacy skills, just to bring to your attention what you'll be seeing happening in your schools, the teachers will have testing materials. They'll have things that the children, some of the tests are administered orally, so there won't be an actual physical piece of paper in front of the child, but some of them there is a physical piece of paper. And I just want to take a moment to speak to this because I'm thinking of questions that came up in my training with our staff. When Una first was introducing the idea of the research of that goes into these screenings, I just want to make sure, especially as principals, I know because I get the phone calls all the time, you guys are constantly getting sales pitches from companies because marketing, the world of marketing and publishing is very, very smart, and they know there's money to be made with this change of curriculum. And I want you to be aware, and this is what the whole, I think, driving force behind ONlit is to have us be informed customers when it comes to the instructional tools that we're using. And there's a lot of companies out there claiming to sell screeners and diagnostics. And so when it comes to the screeners that were approved by the ministry, it's because they are appropriately labeled as screeners. And they did have to go through a selection criteria. There was a panel to make sure that they were vetted properly. And so just a little neat thing to speak to, I think, is that even when you see a measure, this one would be called letter naming identification, or I can't remember the name of it right now. Sorry, letter naming fluency. Even the font that is chosen for the letters, the size of the letters, how the letters are arranged row by row, the amount of research that goes into it is absolutely astronomical. And if you're interested in that, as Una said, a proper screener would come with a technical manual that explains that. So that's, I just want to really drive that in, that these are appropriate screeners. Another thing that I learned as a mistake of mine when doing training is I first had to say what I'm going to tell you next before I showed the teachers a piece of text from one of these screeners. So you show the teachers what a grade 1 child is being asked to read at the beginning, middle, or end of year when it comes to an oral reading fluency. And some teachers almost fainted saying, oh my goodness, my grade 1s could never read that. And so something that's important for you to share with your staff is that all of these items are pieces of testing material. They're all there to be able to accommodate for children that are going to score well below benchmark and well above benchmark. And so when you see, for example, that grade 1 beginning of year text, it doesn't mean a kid has to be able to read that in 1 minute at the beginning of the year. It means that's the piece of testing material that has undergone research to be proven to be highly predictive of future reading success. So it's a piece of testing material. So that's really important for our teachers to understand. And so now, in speaking about the screeners that have been approved, there are in the English stream 3 choices. And so your board will have made a decision as to which screener they have chose to be administered for your English stream. And I do know that they may have chose to purchase a digital tool so that it could actually be scored and administered using touchscreen devices or tablets. But there also is the ability to do, and I'm not sure if it's all of them, Dr. Malcolm, but I do know Acadians, for example, you can score it with paper pencils. So there is a way to do it. But if your school board is doing it paper pencil, just remember the other part of the mandate is that the data is stored somewhere. So that is the second piece of the puzzle that your school board will give you direction towards. When it comes to French immersion, there was only one choice, and so that's Acadians Reading Francais. Right now, currently, it only comes in paper pencil format, but there is different options for school boards to use in regards to storing the data. So find out from your board if you're not aware if they are using paper pencil administration or digital. And I did actually hear a friend from another board saying, we had these iPads delivered and I don't know what it's for. So it might be for that. So make sure you know that's why you might be getting new tech. So also when some of the digital products, they come right with the built-in data storage. But again, if you're using paper pencil or depending on what your board approved, you might have to look for alternatives for actually, we shouldn't talk about where it's being stored. Actually, in regards to looking at the data is more important. And so you always, the goal, not just for assessing individual students and looking at, the predictability of the outcomes, but it's looking at a whole class or a whole system. And so you will want that data somewhere where you're going to be able to look at it and investigate it. And there, Alicia just put in the chat there that on ONlit in the resource bank, there also is this spreadsheet that can be used for that purpose if you don't already have a tool for that as a digital platform. So how do we use the data? So the whole mandate for the new language curriculum is coming from, or the driving force is for explicit systematic instruction, or some people call it structured literacy. And that has two key points to it. So what are we teaching and how do we teach? And all of that should be driven by data. And so when it comes to, the ministry, how did they decide that this is the movement that we're going towards? It's all based on research. We know from science what to teach. It is one of the most undisputable scientific facts of how a brain learns how to read. We know what areas of the brain need to be spoken to, if you'll say, in instruction, and we know what is part of a proper systematic and explicit literacy instruction. How do we teach? That comes from cognitive science research, and we know best practices when it comes to teaching, and that's what was used to inform the new curriculum. And so this is new for us. This is new for everybody in Ontario. I've met a couple teachers that fell upon screening, a couple of years ago. But because this is new for us, I know there is a lot of anxiety out there. And I know a lot of teachers are coming to you guys, the principals. And so we all need to know that this is a learning curve for all of us. I find myself saying very often that this is a long game. This is a new initiative in the province. It's going to take us a little while to figure everything out, but there's a lot of help. And I keep talking about ONlit because that is what they're here to do. And there's things like this one example here, this making sense of screening graphic that is super helpful. And what it is it's taking those essential skills and the subset measures that the teacher would have administered and helping a teacher look at where did my student have a deficit and what do I need to do to help them. So what is this chart essentially doing? Helping primary teachers figure out how to make instructional groups. So primary teachers, are very familiar with teaching in groups. And so now we're actually going to be making groups that are based on skill set and being able to help those children come up to benchmark. Another really important point that I find myself repeating often is that with this new mandate, we do need to brace ourselves for our results when it comes to the first administration, because this is new. So I know within systems, there have been leaders, that have implemented this curriculum from day one last September, like we were supposed to. But a lot of us are on that journey of learning. And I have to tell you that I have heard people, I know Dr. Malcolm and Alicia Smith there, we have heard this from people all around the world that are saying Ontario has the Cadillac of curriculums. Our foundational skills continuum is beautiful, and a lot of people refer to it as a scope and sequence. You may have heard that term a lot. Scope is just a fancy way of saying what do we have to teach, and the sequence is the order we have to teach it. There is no scientific evidence that says one scope and sequence is definitely better than another. But there are rules to developing a scope and sequence for literacy. And there are products out there that do not follow an evidence-based scope and sequence. So to be able to look at a ministry mandated scope and sequence that is informed by research and evidence is quite beautiful. And there are provinces and states that are jealous of us or might be getting ready to copy us. But what it's basically saying is that it's telling us the order of instruction, and it speaks to both how we teach and what we teach. But the important thing is, though, if you start to become very familiar with these screeners, you will quickly recognize how directly related our scope and sequence is to those benchmark goals. And so if you're not teaching the scope and sequence that's mandated by the province, you're going to have trouble finding success with your students reaching those benchmarks. And so that is an important message, not to stress anybody out, but it's more of a message of, I think, comfort, because knowing that you're following the scope and sequence will ensure that you will enjoy success when it comes to administering the screeners. And so again, that speaks to products and what instructional tools people are using, because if you're trying to be sold something that isn't in alignment with our ministry mandated scope and sequence, it's going to be hard. You're going to have to do some somersaults and backflips to try and make them align. So screening for systems, and I've already mentioned a lot of this. When you look at your data, as an administrator, you're going to be looking at school data, you're going to be looking at a class, and you're going to be looking for patterns. Again, give it time. We're going to fall into this practice as we practice. But again, when we're looking at these results, it's going to tell us a lot about some of these things. So for example, the instructional resources I've already spoken to. We want to make sure we're using high-end, good quality in alignment with our ministry mandated sequence to ensure success. Instructional fidelity. There could be, a system or a teacher or a class where, I'm using the program that, we're pretty sure is good and we're pretty sure it's aligned, but I'm not getting those results. So sometimes we have to ask the hard questions about ourselves as teachers. Am I following the program with fidelity? Am I doing it the way that it was meant to be used? And so that's also some reflection we're going to have to do. I often think of my years as a high school science teacher. If I gave the kids a test and everybody got question number 3 wrong, I didn't think, oh, they're all, silly, they weren't paying attention. I immediately would think, what did I do wrong? What did I teach wrong? Why did nobody know the answer to number 3? So it's a time for us to reflect on our practices. Professional development. And again, that's what ONlit is here to help with. There's a lot of learning, and you can go in and teach a program with fidelity, but when you have the understanding of why we're doing the things that we're doing, it really is reassuring for some of us. Some people want to dive in deeper than others. And I have to point out that ONlit has professional learning modules that are free. You go into the website and it's, like taking a mini master's class in the new language curriculum. And it really is helping people to build capacity with their systems of understanding of what's going on. And scheduling, we as principals, that's, I know, your favorite topic. So coming up with timetables and trying to figure out how are you going to coordinate interventions in the classroom, or other instructors or teachers or educational assistants coming in for assistance. And when you start to get data from your screening, it will help you make those decisions as to where to put that support within your school or within your classrooms. And Doctor, you're going to speak to this for us.
Sure thing. I really appreciate how Marlene framed that out. Certainly, we know the incredible power of screeners in identifying individual students who are in need of support, and thinking of our role as educators, we owe them. We owe them to use the most high quality, most research-based tools to allow us to do that well. However, we also know that this is not necessarily something where we can problem solve our way with individual students to these stronger outcomes. There is often a lot of risk in systems. There are often many students who are having difficulty. We certainly see that with older students as well. So it's important to recognize that we do absolutely want to use screeners to identify this child is in need of support, but we're missing a massive opportunity to build our systems around effective practices with the help of screeners if we don't also consider a systems piece. So you'll see on this slide here that we've given some sample data. This is real data from a TDSB French immersion grade 1-2 classroom from the last school year. It was a grade 1-2 classroom. This is just the grade 1, so that's why there are not very many students. But we just thought it would be helpful to show this because screening really gives the data that we need to have bigger picture conversations and to think really about how the overall health of our system. So you'll notice for this class in September, there was a very high degree of risk coming into grade 1. Most of those grade 1s, all but one, were at risk. So we can think of that red as being well below benchmark, that yellow as being below benchmark, and that green as being on track. And when I say benchmark, I mean those research standards that tell us this child has a pretty good chance of being okay down the road. So we're looking at data that show that the vast majority of children are on track to have difficulty with reading. And through a year, less than a school year actually, of explicit instruction, this wonderful teacher did a phenomenal job at reducing the overall risk in her classroom and frankly, dramatically changing, I would say, these students' outcomes in terms of what's to come for them. And to me, I just think this is a really powerful piece, again, not only to remind us about the power of instruction and how we can really change trajectories for children, but also the importance of using this type of data for school improvement, of recognizing this gives us a really good, rigorous, evidence-based way of understanding, how is our instruction? Are we successfully meeting that goal of making it so as many students as possible? Often you'll hear that number of around 80% of students reaching proficiency just with core reading instruction, just with classroom reading instruction. Now, that doesn't mean we only expect 80% of students to learn to read. Obviously, that's not the case. We're going for every child. We want every child reading, but knowing that most students with high quality evidence-based structured literacy instruction should be able to do pretty well just with classroom instruction. We see that reflected in these data. So I think it's really important to frame out that we can look at patterns across a school year, across different conceptualizations of data to understand the health of our system. There we go. And then screening can also help us make decisions about how we teach. So this is a hypothetical set of two grade 1 classrooms. It's inspired by a conversation that our curriculum assistance team had this week with an ONlit user. You may be familiar, we have an info line, info@onlit.org, where educators can submit questions and get customized answers specific to their context. So we're having some discussions around this. And there was an educator who had done some screening with their teaching partner, and we're having some conversations about, what does this look like across these two grade 1 classrooms, recognizing there's a fair amount of risk in both classrooms. Obviously, we'd have more granular data specific to the individual subtest. So there's additional information that we haven't given you just on this slide. But, would this be a context where those two teachers could team teach, where they could share students, they could allow for more homogeneous groups that would allow them to maximize the amount of instructional time students have with the educator and minimizing potentially the amount of time they spend working independently at centers or stations, something we want to consider when we have a large number of students who are at risk. So really just highlighting that screening lets us, again, gives us that reliable data to think about how we can set up our systems best to meet the needs of students. We certainly want to problem solve around individual students, but we also need to think bigger picture about how are we building systems so every child can be successful. And Marlene, I will pass that back. Feel free to jump in if there's anything I missed, but I will pass it back to you.
I thought of something I want you to speak to in a couple slides. So who and when? So the ministry's mandated that all students in they say year 2 kindergarten because not everybody uses the term senior kindergarten. So year 2 kindergarten, grade 1 and 2. And again, the message is all students. So we have a little chart here that's also included in that document of what, as administrators, you are responsible for making sure gets done, or what's been mandated is the timeline of administration. So we're going to talk about what the ministry is mandating, and then we're going to talk about something else. So first it says mandatory initial screener administered by mid-November. That is what's straight out of the PPM. So all year 2, grade 1 and 2 kids all have to have that beginning of year screener administered. Then they're telling us that when you find out if a child is below benchmark, then it's mandatory that they do the second screener at the end of the year, and they say that should be administered by mid-March. If a child achieves benchmark or well above benchmark in that initial screener, then that last screener becomes optional. So this is where we have to have a conversation about what's being mandated as opposed to what best practice will be and what our goal is in future. As teachers, we can recognize easily, I think, that a child being screened and found to be a benchmark on a Monday, that might not be the case on a Wednesday. And so when you're looking at administering a screener at the beginning of the year, and then there's an exemption for end of the year screener, That is what's being mandated. That legally is what teachers are responsible for doing, but hopefully our goal will move from, I want to reference Erica Chesnick. I remember her saying we have to move from compliance to buy-in as a province. And I feel like this is where when teachers recognize the value and systems recognize the value of the screener, we will move towards probably the practice of beginning, middle, and end of year, which is recommended. But for now, what is mandated is what's on this paper. And so that's what we are responsible for doing. And so a timeline for sort of your to-do list as a principal, again, another graphic version of this is found on that PDF. So the ministry did state within the first week of school, there should be a letter sent home to inform parents that the screeners will be administered. And they did give us an example letter. You should check with your school boards. Some boards I know, as mine, we did make a letter template with our letterhead and everything for our system to use. So that may exist within your system. So find out. And I don't know if maybe you're responsible for writing that letter, then use the guidance from the example letter provided by the ministry. And then by mid-November, because that's when that first screener has to be done, then you should make sure, like check in with your staff that those are done, because step number 4, I'm jumping ahead, the teachers will have to record on their communication of learning or the report card in grade 1 and 2 the date that they administered the screener. So you want to make sure that that is done by the due date of mid-November. After screener communication, step 3 should be done with the parents. And again, there was a letter provided by the ministry as an example letter of how you communicate the results with parents. So again, see if your school board's provided one or if you should work off that template from the ministry. And then at the end of the year, mid-March, again, if the student is required to do that second end of the year screener because they were below or well below benchmark, then those need to be administered by the end of the year, mid-March. So when it comes to the communication on the reports or communication of learning for kindergarten, there is a place where the teacher will write the date the screener was administered. And then there is a space, there's 3 boxes. There's a yes or a no. So yes, they were at or above benchmark, or they check no, they were below or well below benchmark. There's also an NA box. And I do know that there is some questions about that. Una, do you want me to speak to it, or do you want to? Okay, so what has been communicated to the province as of right now is all students have to have a screener administered. And remember that first one's mandatory. So my understanding would be that the NA box would be reserved for the end of the year report or communication, where if the student didn't have to have the screener administered, that's when you could use the NA box. Am I correct, or do you know anything more than that?
I believe also for students who are not in that year 2 to grade 2 grade. So if there's a different grade where they're older than grade
Oh,
2, they would
yes,
also have the not applicable for that as well, because
yes.
they're beyond that age range.
Yeah, and so what she's speaking to is because in primaries they have the same report card template, and so if you're in grade 3 and you don't have the mandated screener, then you would check off that NA box. Okay. And I just saw somebody ask if we could post the timeline. It is in that document. The screeners, what principals need to know, the timeline is there. And again, this is straight out of the PPM 168. So what are our next steps? Again, we've spoke a lot to this. So our next steps is to ensure that we are delivering structured literacy, and we're using that data to determine what to teach. The how to teach is part of that, but it really does, I feel, speak more to the what to teach and the interventions. I can't think of anything else for that. I do want to find a moment, and I'm going to use this slide. One thing that I remember, and I got questions about, and I had them answered, but I know Dr. Malcolm can speak to it better, is when we're looking at those results, I know we hear the word risk, and I think it's very scary. It is a scary word, and we see the red, and that's scary. But when I was at a training session, I actually got to speak to one of the researchers from one of the screening companies, and I said, can you just explain to me, like, the wording with at, below, above benchmark? And I really like how she put it, and I'm going to see if Dr. Malcolm wants to add to it. But when you look at the verbiage that goes along with being able to communicate about a child being at, below, whatever level they are at benchmark, even when a child gets the identification at being above benchmark, it still comes with the verbiage that with continued core instruction, they are in line, for future success at a certain percentage. It's not saying, okay, the kid can read, you're out. And so that's really important. And if a child is found to be below benchmark or in the red or at risk, it shouldn't, I know it sounds scary, but it's not that scary of a word because we know from the research, the data, and with structured literacy that the large majority, almost all of the children, will be able to get to benchmark. And so we have to, I remember Laura Bross said this in an ONlit meeting last year. She said we have to own our data. So we can't be scared of the red. It just has to help us know how to move forward. And so that is something that your teachers will be anxious about, and or all of us will be. So we do have to sort of bring the temperature down and understand the interpretation of those results. And I promise administering the screeners are not that scary. They are quick. It just takes a little bit of practice, and it's something that will go, I'm sure, well. Just to let you know that coming up very soon, so next Friday, I guess, a lot of school boards have a PA day. Not everybody does, and that's okay because there will be a recording. But Dr. Malcolm will be leading us through a full day of professional development. So do you want to, Una, do you want to speak to what's going to happen on that exciting day?
Sure. Well, we're very much looking forward to spending some time. We've got a whole day carved out for that. It will be recorded, so if you don't have a PD day or if you have mandated activities that need to happen, not a problem. You can catch the recording later. But what we really did want to frame out was how screening fits. Certainly the importance of screening, and then how screening fits with other assessments, diagnostic assessments, progress monitoring, and how that maps onto individual foundational skills. So thinking especially about those key skills that are in that foundations of language continuum, that B2 continuum. What does screening look like for those skills? What does effective instruction look like for those skills? And we've got a good amount of time carved out for that. So we should really be able to dig into that in terms of using, how can we use data from different sources to support the most effective instruction for our students. So we're very much looking forward to it. We will also be offering this in French as well. So we'll have parallel sessions. So if you're a French immersion educator or depending on your context, you have the option there as well.
Perfect. Also, we love books and we love recommending good books. Don't get any kickbacks, but this is a good one. This is, I think, so valuable for teachers. So next steps in literacy instruction, it is literally a user manual for screeners and for teachers. It goes through exactly what is a universal screener, and it speaks generically. So it doesn't speak to a specific product, even though it does mention ones. All three of our province ones are in there. And it tells you what even ideas for little group instruction or whole class instruction of what you could do if you're finding a deficit in a skill and how to teach to that. It's amazing. And it also goes into diagnostics. And there's a whole world of talking we could do in regards to progress monitoring, and we will do that in the future. But those screeners that you have can also be used for progress monitoring. And then for you guys as principals, this next book would be, I think, one that I know Robin is a huge fan of as a principal herself. And this book here is more in regards to the decision making as a school and as a system, and talking about how to move your system through change in regards to that data. And so the first book I would recommend more to a teacher, and this one more to someone like a principal or a coordinator or a superintendent. Does anybody want to add anything about those books?
I think something that both of those books shares that both of them share is that they are super relevant to our context, but also that both of them are very, very, very clearly written. It is concise, it is clear, it is to the point. They are not difficult reads by any stretch, and both of them have plenty of applicable materials to practice. So next steps, about half of each chapter is instructional activities. So it'll walk through, here's what the skill is, here's how we assess it, here's how you'll know how students are doing, and then here's this whole bank of instructional approaches you can do to target that. In the next steps book, in this book, it walks through how data can be used at different levels of a system and gives really nice materials to support making decisions. There's lots of charts, there's lots of reproducible materials. So I find both of those to be really nicely linked to practice,
Mhm.
and both really really lovely to read. So would highly recommend either and both of them. And we have, if you're interested in running a book study, we have
Yeah.
next step specifically, we are offering, sorry, Marlene, you may actually be
I
about
just
to talk
went back.
Oh,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah.
We're midway through a book study now at this point. Jordan Sloan is hosting a book study for Next Steps in English and in French. But if you're interested in walking through this text with teachers and educators in your school, we do have the book study slides on the website on ONlit that you can use. They're editable, so you can add in content that's specific to your school, the resources that you offer, your board's policies. So we hope to take away some of the heavy lifting. So we've created some book study slides that we hope anybody who needs them will use them.
Hmm. And then just a shout out to ONlit has tons of resources as we keep shouting out and webinars and live events and workshops, but there are some that are catered just towards system leaders. And so Systems Change Collaborative is led by Dr. Andrea Fraser. And that actually you go on to ONlit, you register to be accepted. And in that Systems Collaborative meetings, we have principals, superintendents, and consultants, and there is a time to make connections. And so I think that there's another one, Data Informed Systems, a recording of Dr. Fraser talking about how to move forward with the data. We have lots of handouts and things to help you with the communication in regards to, what to say to your teachers and your parents in regards to screening. And I'm trying to move along so we can get to questions. Again, if you go to ONlit, you can sign up. And the only reason why you might want to sign up is because then you can register for these events. And follow us on social, because that's where I always find out when new things have been released in the resource library and about events. And we would love to hear from you. So I think we want to make sure there's time for questions. So Alicia, go ahead.
Great, thanks. So we do have some time for questions. So I would encourage anybody watching, if you have any questions, to just put those in the chat, and then I can direct them to our lovely panelists. So that we do have one really good question in here, which I know we've actually received this through the info line, and Una has actually had a conversation about this recently with the ministry. And the question is there an adapted or modified screener for minimally verbal students or other special needs that won't be able to access a non-modified or adapted screener? So how would you respond to that, Una? Or
I
should I say Dr. Malcolm? Because that's
No, you really don't need to say that. We've had lots of doctor talk tonight, and that's probably more than enough. Sorry about that. Okay. I'm not aware of any sort of additional adaptive measures. Not anything that I'm aware of, and also coupled that, not anything associated that I'm aware of with any of the three ministry approved tools. From my understanding, based on the PPM is quite clear that all students are to be screened. It is not ONlit that creates that policy, though. It's the ministry. So I think any specific questions in regards to that, that are really quite specific to the PPM in terms of, the students who will be screened, I think it's probably best to direct to the ministry. But I am not aware of any adapted materials for students with, who might be nonverbal or who might, have a variety of different exceptionalities. Feel free to jump in, anybody else.
I'm going to ask a follow-up question because I know you know the answer to this. Specifically in the technical manuals for some of the screeners, it does address these questions. I am not familiar with the technical manuals of all of them. I think Acadience is the tool that's being used most frequently in the province at this point. And I think there is some text in there about the appropriateness of that tool for specific populations. So maybe, Una, you could just direct people to where they might find that.
Sure. So that is depending on, and I will say that I know Acadience best, but obviously there are three approved tools. So there's Acadience, there's also Ames Web Plus, and there's Easy CPM. But I know specific to Acadience in the not in the technical manual, but in the administration manual. So there's a guide that walks through. It's a big PDF, and it walks through all the different measures, how to administer them, how to score them. There's a section at the beginning that talks about the appropriateness of Acadience for different subgroups of students. So it talks about language learners and highlighting some of the research that shows that it is still valid and reliable for students who are learning English in school as an additional language. It does talk specifically about other populations of students as well. So it's in the assessment manual, and can be downloaded for free. It's not behind a paywall.
Great, thanks. Let's see if there are any other questions in the chat. Not seeing a lot of questions in the chat. Was there anything that any of our panelists wanted to add?
I'll jump in there. Alicia is a principal talking to, I think, some other principals. And that is the biggest thing is about building a culture of data use in the school that moves away from that compliance, but more to inform us and then respond to it. And I think with the screeners, the talk and the running the risk of using it solely to identify students who are at risk, but also in my role is to strengthen tier one. And that if we only use it to identify, we really run the risk of our interventions becoming overwhelmed in our buildings. And so as an administrator, really thinking about that data use, high expectations, data-informed decisions. And as Marlene mentioned, what Laura Ross would say is about that data, if we don't own it now, we can't own it later when we see all the great improvements that are going to happen. So best of luck, and any questions from administrators, shoot me an email or ask a question anytime.
I do just want to piggyback off of what Robin said, specific to the interventions. Kate Wynn is a member of our ONlit team. She's a phenomenal kindergarten teacher in the Peterborough, Victoria, Northumberland, Clarington Catholic Board. And she, her school has been, has been doing some, her board has been doing some early screening pilots. Her educators in her school have been doing that as well for a couple of years, and they've been working on really strengthening that tier one structured literacy instruction. And she let us know earlier this year that previously in other years, her school would have 2 Empower groups and would have many other students who probably would benefit from Empower, just in terms of the number of students who need that intervention in later grades. But this year was the first year where they didn't even have enough students to fill 1 Empower group. So really, gives that concrete piece of, if we can prevent the need for really intensive intervention with good tier one instruction, then isn't that better for students, for families, and for educators? I mean, that's a win all around. So I think that I just wanted to highlight that as a practical example of really that focus on tier one is not in place of focusing on older students who need intervention. We absolutely recognize that's a really important part of meeting every child's human rights, but recognizing that our systems are more able to provide that when there are fewer students who need that intensive instruction.
And that's a really nice segue, Una, into the next question that's in our chat, which is really about using screening for students in grade 3 and above. So maybe if you could just speak to the tools, the 3 tools that all school boards now have access to and what they have available for older students.
Sure, I don't mind starting, and then Marlene and Robin, feel free to jump in, because I know the junior intermediate space is something where it's not mandated, but there's certainly some exciting work that's happening, in these bands, definitely. So it is something where these approved screeners are it's not just that they have K2 material. So the screeners approved, depending on the company, might have up to grade 6, might have up to grade 8. So I will just start by saying that there are screening tools available. It's not mandated, and that would be something that would be an individual educator's professional judgment in terms of whether that's something that they would like to be using for their particular class. The thing that gets more challenging is if it is a paid license or a digital paid license, there may not necessarily be funding for that. My understanding is that the funding is tied specifically to K2 students. For example, Acadians, we often say, we've been making reference to it. They do offer free PDF materials that can be downloaded for free from their website. So if this would be an educator in grade 3 or up who wants to get an idea of what's that temperature like for my class, that could be something where they could download those materials as well. It certainly gives, very important, helpful data for older students as well, and gives that opportunity, depending on the profile of the class. An educator might want to do a little bit of testing back and to check in with different lower subskills if that would be appropriate, if there's bigger areas of need. But Marlene, Robin, feel free to jump in. I think it's an important consideration to chat about junior as well.
I can. My life goal would be to see a system where people are doing this up till grade 8. As we're learning, there's so much exciting research that's being shared with Ontario educators right now. And as people start to come upon their learning in regards to oral reading fluency, or the ORF, I think junior and intermediates will get very excited, and there is lots of resources on ONlit for that. As administrators and as a province, our focus doesn't need to be what's on mandated right now, but there is nothing stopping anybody from moving towards installing screening and these proper, appropriate reading assessment tools in junior and intermediate grades also.
Well, we are at our 8:30 exactly. So thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Thank you, Marlene and Robin and Dr. Malcolm for presenting this workshop. If anyone is interested in the recording, we will have that up on our YouTube channel soon. And be sure to stay tuned to ONlit and continue to check out the website for more interesting and wonderful informational opportunities. Thank you and good night.